The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our presentation of Risky Ingredients, a webinar hosted by Dr. Douglas Marshall, Chief Scientific Officer with Eurofins Microbiology. My name is Sarah Curran. I am with Eurofins Marketing, and I'll be here to take care of a few housekeeping items before we get started with the presentation. First thing, everyone should know that this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available to everyone who is on the line right now and everyone who registered. In 1 to 2 days, a recording will also be sent to everyone who registered, as will the presentation slides. If there is time at the end of the presentation, we will do a live Q&A with Doug Marshall. If there's not time for Q&A, if we run up along the hour, we will record all of the questions that you guys submit during the presentation and respond to them via email following the presentation. To submit a question during this presentation, please use the question box in your GoToWebinar dashboard. It's very simple. You just expand the questions dashboard, type in your question, hit enter. That'll be stashed in a database for us along with your name and contact information, and we will get an answer to you in a timely fashion. With that, I will hand our presentation over now to Dr. Doug Marshall, our Chief Scientific Officer with Eurofins Microbiology. Doug?
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate everyone's interest in the topic of today's webinar, and hopefully this next hour will go quickly and you'll have a bit of enlightenment on how to understand a management practice for risky ingredients in your products or your process. So for those of you unfamiliar with Eurofins, we have a very simple mission, and that's to improve the health and safety of consumers worldwide. In most of the markets that Eurofins participates in, we are the #1 market shareholder in those markets. Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. Our primary service areas in food are contaminants testing, nutrition testing, authenticity testing, microbiology testing, and DNA testing. We also offer services such as educational programs that you're participating in now, but also include auditing, training, and consulting. In terms of a perspective that our regulators have on risky ingredients, a very important thing for you to consider as a rationale for why FSMA came to law is the following. FDA believed at the time that there was a significant lack of understanding of the hazards associated with the company's food products. And FDA studies showed that up to 60% of all problems originated with a supply chain issue. The other item is a lack of training in employees knowing they're likely to occur hazards and what to do when they are shown to be present. So when it comes to being FSMA compliant, understanding risky ingredients is a key component to being able to have a fully functioning food safety program. I want to get into defining exactly what risk means because many people have different opinions on what risky behavior is. So this is a snapshot from a very famous movie showing one of the potential consequences to risky behavior. So if you look at Webster's dictionary definition, or if you're in the wiki, you can also pull this up there too. Risk is defined as the possibility of loss or injury, and you can contemplate what that means in terms of a food manufacturer's risk. And it also involves the degree of probability of such loss. So you could have something that is highly risky, but if it's infrequent, that plays into how you're considering the risks that might be associated with that ingredient. And here are a couple of other ways to contextualize the definition of risk. We feel that this product presents a significant risk to public health. And there are some other synonyms that might also be thrown around there. Obviously, when you're talking about hazard analysis, the first thing you should be doing is assessing the risk of all the ingredients that are associated with manufacturing of that product. But some other things could be menace, peril, pitfall, danger, threat, or trouble. None of these obviously are healthy things for a food manufacturer to contemplate. So that determines what the food safety risk. Let's talk about business risk, because some of these may not be so obvious, but are important things for you to contemplate just in terms of your day-to-day handling of your business practices. So you could have accidental or incidental contamination versus intentional contamination. Which of those is riskier? That's for you to decide. There's economically motivated fraud as a business risk, because you certainly wouldn't want your product to be splattered all over headlines being associated with an economic fraud incident. You could have ingredient risk associated with doing business with a sole source ingredient supplier. So you're putting significant business risk in the ability of that supplier to continue to provide you with products that are meeting your risk profile of acceptance. Another thing that is of growing concern, it's not necessarily food safety risk, but these are what I call the anti-everything campaigns. So there are significant consumer advocacy groups out there that are actively looking for targets to be able to promote their particular agenda. So we have campaigns that are out there against GMOs, against gluten, against sugar, against carbs, hormones, and so forth. So the risk that you're taking that an ingredient supplier is going to be nailed in one of these campaigns might be significant and force you to consider how well to better manage that risk. So I want to start off by talking about questions you should be asking when you're doing your risk assessment. So has the product ever been associated with an outbreak or a recall? If that's the case, then history can be a good guide for you in helping you define what that risk is for that material. Has the industry associated with that ingredient ever been associated with an outbreak or a recall? Again, learning from history helps you better manage the risk that you may have with that ingredient. Are there any regulatory considerations or requirements associated with that material? Is the raw product that's a source of that ingredient subject to both biological, chemical, or physical contamination hazards? Is the product at risk from cross-contamination somewhere during the manufacturing or handling or transportation, or your use of that ingredient? Does the product undergo an intervention step to reduce pathogenic microbes? If so, is that a validated and verifiable step? And does it also reduce harmful pathogens? How is the product packaged? How is it stored? How is it transported? All of those things that are relevant to after manufacturing risk are important for you to consider. And then is the facility environment a source of contamination with either spoilage organisms, pathogens, or allergens? This is a food safety risk analysis matrix, and I want to briefly go over this with you. If you start in the upper left-hand corner, you've got a likelihood of occurrence across the vertical axis and the severity of consequences across the horizontal axis. So if you have a likelihood of occurrence that's very unlikely, in other words, we have no historical event that informs us of that, and if it did occur, that the severity of the consequence was minor injury or no lost time, or really an insignificant consequence, then that would be the lowest risk component of this risk matrix. If you go in the lower right-hand corner, if you have a occurrence rate that's very likely to occur, and the consequence is the consumer could die if they get exposure to that product, then that's your highest risk for an extreme risk category. And so you could use this sort of risk matrix to be able to provide a numerical risk ranking for all of the ingredients you're using in your products. And this also helps you then focus your resources on attempting to better manage the risks that are higher up in this risk ranking. We can also learn from risk assessment activities that are being undertaken by regulatory agencies. So when you look at FDA's website, you can find formal risk assessment activities under the following category. So they're working on allergens, gluten, drug residues, some chemical contaminants, specifically arsenic in rice and apple products, filth and salmonella in spices, food additives, melamine, methylmercury in seafoods, and BSE in beef products. So obviously, if you're sourcing ingredients that have potential to have any of these there, I would encourage you to look at FDA's opinion on how to better manage those risks. Both FDA and USDA are conducting formal microbial risk assessment activities on the following items. So produce grown with manure, hepatitis A in fresh produce, avian influenza virus in poultry and eggs, Listeria monocytogenes in high-risk product categories such as soft ripened cheeses, deli meats, and ready-to-eat foods, Australian perfringens in cooked meats and poultry, salmonella in tree nuts, spices, and eggs, norovirus in shellfish, and Vibrio parahemolyticus in raw molluscan shellfish. USDA has also, as well as FDA, have published a formal risk assessment for Listeria monocytogenes. Now, this is several years old, but there is a formal risk ranking of all these kinds of food products. So if you have ingredients going into these food products and they are subject to Listeria monocytogenes contamination, then that will help you understand how to risk rank that particular pathogen in these kind of product categories. We turn to chemical contaminants. Some information that might be relevant to you is published by the Agency for Toxic Substances. So there's probably, I think the last I looked at that, 2 million registered chemicals. But the Agency for Toxic Substances risk ranks the top 275. And so this is their top 10, and I think it's pretty easy to see that many of these are potential food contaminants. Certainly the top 3 we know have a history of being chemical hazards in foods. So if you don't have a risk assessment of these in your ingredient supply, you run the risk of inheriting these chemical agents in that supply chain. Then we have California Proposition 65, and here's the warning statement that if you have an ingredient that is on their list of verboten chemicals, you must declare this on your label. And it simply says, this product contains a chemical known by the state of California to cause cancer and birth defects or other reproductive harm. So there's over 800 listed chemicals, and if your product has residue of those chemicals, then you need to make this declaration. The problem is this declaration is not risk-based. So you could have a potentially harmful chemical at minuscule amounts, and that dosage is irrelevant to the Proposition 65 declaration. This list is updated yearly, so you want to make sure that at least once a year you review that list and make sure that you don't have additional chemicals to be worried about. You can petition the state of California for an exemption for potentially harmful chemicals that are naturally occurring. So I'll just use the example here methylmercury in fish. That's something that both wild-caught as well as aquaculture fish have potential residues in the edible flesh. But to be able to get that exemption, you have to do a series of studies, and it's very expensive to be able to prove that these are naturally occurring versus unintentionally or intentionally added chemicals. So these are some of the more recent problem children that our customers are having, being compliant with Proposition 65. So acrylamide is one that we're having lots of conversations about, because this is formed when heating the protein amino acid asparagine in the presence of sugars. So you can form acrylamide as part of that heating process. You can also get this form when oxidized fats are heated, such as in frying oils. So the kinds of products that will have acrylamide bubbles that are measurable include things like breads, chips, French fries, cookies, crackers, cereals, cocoa, coffee, and dehydrated soup mixes. So, one question to ask yourself is, are these naturally occurring? And according to Prop 65, they are formed due to processing, so they're added during processing. This is a lot of different product categories that are getting a lot of scrutiny for acrylamide. And we have things like lead, arsenic, and mercury. These are widely found in nature, so they are considered to be natural constituents of products, but they are considered Proposition 65 chemicals. So are more people going to be asking for exemptions due to the naturally occurring clause? And what kind of evidence do you need to be able to prove your case? Another one that's a frequent conversation is polyaromatic hydrocarbons, also are formed as a byproduct of processing. For example, when meats are charred during cooking. Then we have, I'll just call these oh crap moments, when we have some sort of human-made or natural disaster that creates a huge amount of concern amongst the consuming public, and it becomes an all-hands-on-deck to do that. And I'll just use this one as a recent example. So the Fukushima disaster that occurred in Japan as a consequence of an earthquake and tsunami that caused meltdowns of the reactor site in the Fukushima area. And there was this belief that all this radioactive waste that was being dumped in the Pacific Ocean was going to contaminate every seafood item in the entire ocean and would completely shut down the fisheries there. And in fact, there was cesium-137 that was released into that seawater in the region. But the vast majority of tests, unless you were harvesting directly near the Fukushima site, found no radiation levels that exceeded background radiation levels that were just normal in that seafood. So again, sometimes these events create huge risk profiles of ingredients, but eventually can be determined through testing not to be a serious problem. Let's talk a little bit about allergens. Again, these fall in the chemical food safety hazard. There's a very small population of consumers that can have adverse reactions to certain food proteins. And these adverse reactions are caused because these proteins serve as an antigen and trigger an immune response that can cascade into a harmful event for that suspect consumer. And there are over 160 foods that are known to have allergenic potential, but we only have a small number that are regulated. So the kinds of reactions you might see are things like sensitivity. So this is a negative reaction to the presence of a substance or a compound. Normally, these are considered to be intolerance reactions rather than allergenic reactions. True allergy, where the exposure to that protein causes an immune response, and the more you are exposed to that allergenic protein, that generally increases your sensitivity to that protein. In severe cases, you can get a delayed response where 12 to 36 hours after exposing, you get typical food poisoning event. Could be nausea, vomiting, diarrhea can occur. Occasionally, this could lead into an immediate anaphylactic kind of response, which is a very acute immune response. Some of the early symptoms that are presented include itchy eyes. You get itchy of the hard or soft palate of your throat. Your throat can swell, and you get closure, and you can die due to respiratory distress. And for a food allergy sufferer, your only management tool is to avoid exposure to that protein. Therefore, from a food manufacturer's perspective, you need to declare the presence of that allergenic ingredient on your label so that food allergy sufferers can avoid consuming your product. So again, allergies vary by country. So if you are a diversified manufacturer sending products to a number of different regulatory jurisdictions, please be aware that those regulatory jurisdictions may differ in terms of the regulated allergens. So in the United States, we have the Big Eight. Canada, they have the Big Eight plus sulfite, sesame, mustard. The UK also adds celery and lupins, mollusks, as well as sulfur dioxide. So again, proper label declaration of each of these jurisdictions is one way to manage those ingredient risks. So some recent recall examples. I just want to throw these in because these are educational. So if you look at a company, so these were Nutty Infusions, which is a roasted cashew butter. There was evidence of Listeria monocytogenes after routine FDA inspection of the facility supplier. So the manufacturer was inheriting this as an ingredient supply. Likewise, there was a recall due to salmonella in a chili seasoning package in a taco kit, and they found the presence of salmonella in the raw material. This one was interesting, and again, I'm not picking on individual companies here, using these as examples. So when you look on the manufacturer, this is a dog food product, and the marketing material says the following: we strive to only use meats that are free-range, pasture-raised, and always free of hormones and antibiotics. Our produce is 100% certified organic, and our substances are always pure, organic, and unrefined. No high-pressure processing, always 100% raw the way nature intended. We take great pride in our sourcing, using wonderful local farms and ranches. Just ask us and we'll tell you who they are. Well, routine testing by FDA of a 2-pound bag of this product revealed the presence of salmonella, and that was a recall event for this company. So their marketing said this was the best product ever manufactured, yet if you're using raw meat product as an ingredient with no kill step, you would expect to find salmonella in that product. I have lost control. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Some other recent recalls, again, some other nut butters were recalled because of contamination with some interhemorrhagic strains of E. coli that were not 0157. So if you were thinking about risky ingredients only for 0157, you might ignore the fact that there are other interhemorrhagic strains of E. coli. And then we have things like the flour recalls associated with E. coli also in those products. I'm going to show you a series of slides from one manufacturer that was associated with a series of nut recalls and an outbreak. So 483 is an inspection report issued by FDA when they go in and visit a facility. And so they highlight some of the food safety problems that were observed during those visits. And so in this particular one, there were 6 items of interest to me. almost every single one of these were GMP failures. So if you can just kind of quickly go through this, so there were unsanitary conditions, there were personal hygiene issues, there was pest control problems, there was a storage issue that was not controlled, and the facility was not in sound repair. So that was in 2007. The FDA visited again in 2009. And found 5 of the same issues associated with GMPs. In 2010, they visited again and found almost identical problems. In 2011, they continued to find these problems. And if you're FDA, remember this is all pre-FSMA, FDA had a very difficult time managing these sorts of situations. And this was one of their justifications for FSMA, is giving them mandatory recall and the ability to do something more with companies. And so as a result of all these inspection reports, next slide, please. There was a multi-state outbreak associated with salmonella. There were at least 42 identified cases. There were over 240 products that this company recalled over that period, and some very well-known brands were associated as being part of that recall. And the sad fact is between 2009 and 2011, company testing found at least 11 salmonella contaminated lots with multiple serotypes of salmonella. And so you can follow the civil case of FDA against Sunland and the owner in the docket that's recorded there. So if you were one of the retailers or manufacturers using Sunland products, I would ask the question, given these 483s that are publicly available, why would you want to source your ingredients from this manufacturer, given that kind of history? Next, please. So FDA has been a ingredient supplier verification program, both for domestic suppliers as well as importer requirements, that requires that you as a manufacturer need to be doing some verification activity associated with those raw materials or those ingredients. The FDA now has enforcement authority, so that includes mandatory recalls and suspension of registration. And there's no tolerance for pork shopping, and the data generated to support the COAs must come from accredited laboratories. Next, please. So to give you kind of a perspective of what the international marketplace for ingredients looks like, there was a joint Interpol-Europol operation where they went out for a 3-month period across 57 countries. They pulled food and ingredients from market shops, markets, airports, seaports, and industrial estates. And they were looking for both counterfeit food products as well as substandard food and beverage products. As a result of that 3-month investigation, there were over 3,500 criminal cases filed and 41 arrests. There was a seizure of greater than 11,000 metric tons of food. Over nearly 1.5 million liters of beverages were seized, and over 5.5 million products were removed from international commerce. Again, this is a gigantic number of problems out there in the international marketplace. So I would ask everyone on this webinar, how much of this material are you using in your food products? Yes, please. So some of the problems that they found during this investigation, some of the big items were condiments. So these included things like vegetable oils, salts, peppers, and so forth. Much of this were economically adulterated, so they were substituting lower value food oils for higher value food oils. Fruits and vegetables, the major problem were things like additives such as copper sulfate to be able to fix the green color. For alcoholic beverages, they found several that had some problem ingredients such as propylene glycol. For seafoods, there was rampant species substitution identified. And then for sugar and sweets, there were, again, economic fraud agents that the crystals of some other kinds of materials were being cut into things like bulk sugar. And so in one case, they found fertilizer. And so that obviously is a chemical hazard. And about 20% of all these seizures did have a food safety implication. Next. So you as a manufacturer, you don't want to be in a situation where you're wondering, is this shipment of an ingredient going to give me issues or not? And so the way you deal with that is you have a vigorous ingredient supply chain control program. Next, please. So this is going to be part of your food safety plan. So in your hazard analysis, you should be doing a formal risk assessment of all your ingredients. You should be identifying what are some preventative controls for these ingredients that either your supply chain could provide or things that you can do to be able to mitigate that risk. You should be monitoring the effectiveness of these controls. If you have an out-of-spec data point, you need to be doing corrective actions. You need to be doing regular verification activities of that supply chain. And all of this must be kept in impeccable records. Next, please. So you want to link this risk assessment to your hazard analysis. And again, if you have a supply chain applied preventative control, you need to make sure that that supply chain is actually delivering that control. And so you need to have a record of that, and you need to be doing verification that it was done on that lot that you are receiving. You may have ingredients that may not have a hazard requiring a preventative control. So for example, vinegar, a high acid product that does not have a microbial, chemical, or physical hazard that you may have identified. Therefore, you may not need a preventative control. So you may also have situations where if you have pathogens in that ingredient supply and you have a kill step during the process and you can validate and verify that kill step, then it may be okay for you to go ahead and receive that ingredient with that pathogen. Likewise, if you were manufacturing a product that does not have a kill step, but you know the ultimate customer or consumer will apply a kill step, then you need to make sure that you have a sound understanding with that relationship of that customer that they will indeed apply that preventative control. Next. So some supply chain control documentation is, again, according to FSMA, you need a written supply chain preventative control. And if you have sourcing ingredients from foreign suppliers, you need a foreign supplier verification program as well. You need to document your choice of using a particular supplier. So what are your considerations for buying ingredients from that supplier? What are the procedures you have on receiving for being able to validate that supplier is meeting your purchase specifications? And then determining whether your supplier is applying appropriate preventative controls for that particular ingredient. Next, please. So who controls the hazard? Again, this is from the Food Safety Preventative Controls Alliance training materials. You know, does the supplier control that hazard? Does the receiving facility control the hazard? Or does the customer control the hazard? Next, please. So all three can be an important part. So supply chain program may not be required number one, when no hazards requiring a supply chain applied control exists, or when you, the receiving facility, have a control, such as a kill step, or when your customer or downstream entity provides written assurance that they control the hazard. So these are some elements then in your supply chain program. Number one, you need to use approved suppliers. You need to determine how you come up with that approval process. You need to have verification activities that demonstrate that the supply chain is meeting your expectations. You should conduct periodic supplier verification activities, document those activities, and then verify that that supply chain applied control has been applied by that entity, other than maybe your supplier, if your supplier is appropriate. Next, please. So when you are using your approved suppliers, again, the approval of receiving that material should be done prior to you receiving that ingredient. So you need to have a very good relationship with the chief financial officer and your purchasing department to make sure that the ingredients that you're buying are meeting your purchase specifications. Next, please. These are some verification activities that, again, should be done before using a supplier and then done periodically thereafter. So these activities can include an on-site audit. You could either use first, second, or third-party audits to be able to accomplish that. You can do sampling and testing. These can be done by the supplier as part of a COA that goes with that lot that you're receiving. Or you can do periodic testing to be able to verify the authenticity of those COAs. You can review the supplier's food safety records for that ingredient in that lot. And there could be other kinds of verification activities you can consider doing if they are applicable to your product or your process. Next, please. So what are some considerations then for appropriate verifications? What does this hazard analysis suggest about the nature of the hazard? If it's a hazard that the supply chain can easily control, then it should not be a problem for you to put that expectation on your supplier. And what are the supplier procedures then for being able to validate that their control works as intended and that it's being verified periodically to meet their expectations? Another consideration is looking at the past history of these ingredients. You know, has FDA ever issued a warning letter or an import alert related to that supplier's compliance? Again, look at the data that FDA is providing on that supplier. Do you have any historical tests or audit results of the supplier that indicate a trend? That trend could be positive, in other words, the supplier is doing a great job, or it could be negative. If it's negative, you should be asking yourself whether or not you need to consider altering your relationship you have with that supplier. Obviously, we're not perfect. A supplier may have had an issue. What matters is what did the supplier do to mediate that problem? So look at their corrective actions and look at their recent history to see if that problem is under control. And then think about are the supplier's storage or transportation practices appropriate? So again, who can provide the supplier verification? It could be the supplier. It could be another entity, such as the broker, who is sourcing those ingredients for you. And obviously, it should be the receiving facility. And you know, what kinds of verification activities are you doing to ensure that that ingredient is meeting your expectations? Next, please. So when we talk about onset audit requirements, if you have serious risky ingredients that require supply chain and supply control, you do not want to inherit your supplier problems. So how do you reduce that from happening? Well, number one, you should at least have a documented on-site audit before using that material. And we suggest that, and at least FSMA requirements said that at least annually after that initial audit. And you also should be using a qualified auditor to conduct those audits. An exception is you may document that other verification activities or a less frequent auditing sequence provides adequate insurance. So again, if you believe that the risk is under control and you have the data to support that, you could argue a reduced frequency of verification. Next, please. So once you have all these procedures in place, what are some things you can do to periodically review your program and make sure that it is still meeting your expectations? So the first item here is to compare findings from your verification and non-conformance activities to whatever your purchase specifications are and your contractual requirements for buying that ingredient. So some key points to consider. Does that supplier contract actually have specifications that clearly dictate any concerns you have about the risk associated with that product? And have all of the product safety issues been corrected if you have identified any issues? And then if you have any inclination that the supplier has changed the way they're manufacturing, where they're sourcing raw materials or even other ingredients going into that product, how do you know whether those changes can impact the food safety profile of that ingredient? Similarly, look in your own company and ask whether any of those changes have an impact on the food safety implications of the ingredients you're using. And if they do, then you need to adjust your program as needed to enhance safety of that ingredient. If you find you have a non-conformance of a risky ingredient or any ingredient for that matter, these are some non-conformance actions you should contemplate doing. Number one, clearly identify what the issue is. Clearly articulate the steps that need to be taken to mitigate the effects of that issue. Look at steps that are required to correct the issue. Identify the root cause. And look at modifications of the system that give you a good understanding that that issue, that there now are preventative controls in place to prevent reoccurrence. All this needs to be documented and make sure that those corrective actions have actually been implemented. Obviously, keep records of this contemplation. Next, please. Sampling and testing. Obviously, I work for a testing laboratory, so I'm biased, but you should consider what these data points are going to tell you about the risk of that ingredient. So number one, who does the testing? It can be done by the supplier as part of a COA for that lot. It can be done by an outside lab. It can be done by you, the receiving facility. And if you have these data points, they need to be transmitted to you via certificate of analysis. Be aware that the performing laboratory really needs to be using methods that are fit for purpose. So if you're using an analytical method that is not fit for purpose, then that's going to impact the quality of the data and the reliability of that data because you're making purchase decisions based on those data points. You need to conduct relevant references on appropriate tests for different kinds of products. So I'll just give you an example here. An indicator microbial test may be more useful than a pathogen test to assess the effectiveness of overall control. So despite the fact that we rely frequently on end product pathogen tests, that may not tell the whole story because if the customer is doing a good job, the odds of you finding a contaminated sample are going to be very low. So in this case, I use coliforms as an example of sanitary controls in the manufacturing of dairy products. Next, please. So when you're doing sampling and testing verification, you need to identify what the raw material, the ingredient is. You need to articulate what tests are conducted, including the method used, the date in which the test was conducted on a report, what the results are, and it's a good idea to list corrective actions that you need to take in response to the detection of the hazard. and also identify the laboratory that was doing the testing. Please. Be aware that there is the potential for conflict of interest when it comes to verification testing. And I just want to run through these quickly for you to consider before we finish up. Number one, does company management have a conflict of interest in the testing program? And are there protocols in place to mitigate such conflict? So a conflict of interest could be that if I've got an in-house testing lab, I want to make sure that I have control over that test data. And part of that control could be making sure that we never have a data point that says our product is out of spec. So that obviously is a conflict of interest. Second item here is our laboratory employees trained in ethical behavior regarding things like proper sample collection, proper implementation of testing, and proper reporting. Does the laboratory have written non-conformance policies? And are there any undue influences that impact the integrity of test data? And lastly, it's not uncommon for poor methods to be used to generate data points because that gives the ingredient supplier better data. So make sure that the methods that are being used are temporary methods and are fit for purpose. Next, please. So when we talk about test methods, one way for you to consider the faith and value of those test data is to answer these questions. Is the laboratory conducting the testing accredited to perform those tests? Can lab personnel describe and perform the methods? Is the lab capable of performing sample preparation? Are the methods validated by an independent third party? And are the methods that are being used validated for the matrices of interest? And if not, then the laboratory needs to justify and validate any non-standard methods. And I'm going to finish up by saying laboratories need to be very careful due to math errors. So if you can repeat after me when I read each one of these, quantitative microbiology is, dilution problems are, counting rules are, self-taught brain surgery is. So if you believe, as I do, that the things in red are indeed highly likely, then make sure that the employees in that laboratory are trained to do the tests that are being used, and make sure that those are adequately performed. Next, please. So sometimes laboratories make errors, and sometimes ingredient manufacturers ask laboratories to do retesting. And I need to give this following warning. If a laboratory analytical result comes back positive, let's say for salmonella or Listeria, then a subsequent test can never negate that first test data point. Okay? And if retesting is needed, then there needs to be very clear written articulation for why retesting is desired. And the other thing you have to also understand is that sample homogeneity should not be assumed. So every test method, whether it's chemistry or microbiology, assumes that the sample that was pulled from the production lot was pulled from a production lot where the analyte is uniformly distributed in that lot. In many cases, that is not the case. So again, you could retest and retest. If it all comes back negative, it still does not mean that that lot might be free from that pathogen. Next, please. So I want to thank you very much for your time. We have a few minutes for questions. So please make sure you start throwing those into the question queue. And on behalf of my 30,000 Eurofins employee worldwide, I thank you for your time and interest in this topic, and look forward to talking to you in a future session. Sarah, back to you, please.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Doug. All right, so we do have quite a few questions coming in. First up, I wanted to address some of the more common ones. So we have gotten a lot of questions about if slides and recordings will be sent to attendees, yes, a Eurofins employee will follow up with you after the presentation, and they will be sending you a recording and the presentation slides. So everyone who attended and everyone who registered will be getting a copy of both of those. So Doug, now I'll pitch you a question. What ingredients should be considered under radiological risks?
That's a good question. I think the obvious answer is anytime you would be sourcing ingredients from a geographic location where there is known radiological hazards. And I want to use the past example as some guidance. So several decades ago, there was a Russian nuclear energy reactor that exploded in the Chernobyl region of Ukraine. That event broadcast radiological hazards through many parts of Europe. And so if you knew you were sourcing ingredients that were primarily grown or perhaps even processed in that location, then having a control program for radiological hazards would be highly called for given that knowledge. Likewise, more recently in the Fukushima event, if you knew you were sourcing materials that were grown, harvested, or processed in a region of Japan that had known radiological hazards, then you would want to have a control program for those ingredients. For the rest of the world, I think, again, you need to use your judgment and you need to understand where these supplies are coming from. I don't think that radiological hazards are going to be a significant part of your contemplation.
All right, thank you, Doug. One attendee has asked, are there any known pathogens associated with fruit that would survive a boil kill step?
The question is, fruits that have a boiled step, there will be some spore-forming pathogens that will survive the boiling process, and once that product is cooled, if the product pH is high enough to be able to allow for germination and multiplication of those spores, then it's possible there could be a food safety risk associated with that behavior. But again, it's really related to product pH, how the product is packaged subsequent to the boiling step, and how the product is used by whoever the end customer is, whether it's a further manufacturer or a customer.
All right. Another attendee, Ed, has asked, if you're a wholesaler, everything is imported, but everything is handled by a broker who really only does the importing paperwork, then is the wholesaler responsible for getting all of this information directly from numerous overseas suppliers?
Yes, the broker is the importing agent, and so they are required to have all the foreign supplier verification paperwork in place for that particular shipment. And for many brokers, this is a management nightmare.
All right. I think we have time for just a couple more. Someone has asked, how do you transfer responsibility of a potential presumptive pathogens test back to supply chain?
Well, I think it really depends on, I'm assuming by the I have to make this assumption by the nature of the question, that the receiving company did the test and found a presumptive positive, and they are trying to assess the relationship they have with that supplier on how to manage that data point. One way that I suggest that this be managed is you need to have purchase specifications that clearly articulate what your response is and what the supplier response is to a pathogen test result that's positive. And for most companies, that's going to be rejection of that lot, and that material then becomes the responsibility of that supplier. If, on the other hand, you have knowledge that that same lot is being used, let's say, in a ready-to-eat application by some other manufacturer, then you may want to have a conversation with FDA, because then that may become part of this, the reportable food registry issue.
All right. And then one final question. Someone has asked, how do I get a copy of a company's inspection reports or list of violations and citations?
These are available. So the FDA website, you can just search for 483s, and you can go back multiple years, and it's constantly updated. So you can find all those 483s on the FDA website. And you can also search by company. So if you've got a supplier, you can search by supplier.
Great. Doug, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. I know you're traveling. We all really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us during this presentation. I'd also like to thank all of our attendees for tuning in today. Just remember, someone will be reaching out to you with a copy of all this information and a recording. And with that, I will wrap up our presentation. Thank you, everyone.